the clinking of baccarat crystal champagne flutes, and the soft, ambient hum of a live string quartet echoed through the cavernous, gold-leafed ballroom of the St. Regis Grand. It was a space designed to intimidate, a sprawling architectural masterpiece defined by soaring 60-foot ceilings, imported Italian marble floors that mirrored the light, and cascading crystal chandeliers the size of luxury vehicles. Tonight, the room was suffocatingly heavy with the scent of 10,000 imported white hydrangeas and rare orchids, all carefully arranged to project an aura of absolute, undeniable wealth. It was my son David's wedding day, and it was the exact moment I realized I had completely lost him to a monster. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, dressed in a tasteful, understated navy silk gown. I didn't need to wear diamonds the size of golf balls or draped couture to know my worth. But to my new daughter-in-law, Chloe, my modest appearance was an unforgivable crime against her carefully curated aesthetic. Chloe was a creature born of superficiality, a woman whose entire personality was constructed from Instagram filters, designer labels bought on credit, and a terrifyingly vicious entitlement. The reception had just begun, and the guests, 300 of the city's self-proclaimed elite, were beginning to find their seats for the multi-course plated dinner. I began to walk toward the sprawling, elevated VIP head table, draped in heavy white velvet, eager to take my rightful place beside my only son. Before my foot could even touch the first velvet-lined step of the dais, a sharp, manicured hand slammed against my chest, stopping me dead in my tracks. "And exactly where do you think you're going, Eleanor?" It was Chloe. She stood there in her blindingly white, custom-beaded gown, her eyes narrowed into venomous slits. The sweet, blushing bride facade she had worn during the ceremony had completely melted away, replaced by the sneering, arrogant predator I always knew lurked beneath the surface. "I'm going to my seat, Chloe," I said, my voice low, steady, and perfectly calm. "At the family table, next to my son." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the soft music like a razor blade. Several guests at the nearby tables stopped talking, their eyes darting toward the confrontation. "The family table?" Chloe mocked, her voice rising an octave, making sure the surrounding wealthy guests could hear every single humiliating word. "Eleanor, look at yourself. You are wearing a dress that looks like it was pulled off a clearance rack at a department store. This head table is going to be photographed for Modern Bride magazine. You do not fit the aesthetic. You look cheap, you look tired, and quite frankly, you are an embarrassment to the brand David and I are trying to build." A collective, deafening gasp rippled through the front of the ballroom. 150 pairs of eyes locked onto me, waiting for me to crumble. I slowly turned my gaze past Chloe's diamonds and looked directly at my son, David. He was sitting at the center of the VIP table, perfectly within earshot. He heard every single word. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose college tuition I had worked 80-hour weeks to pay for, to defend his mother. David simply looked down at his Rolex, took a slow sip of his whiskey, and completely turned his head away. The betrayal felt like a frozen dagger sliding between my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask of stone. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. "So," Chloe smirked, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive, nauseatingly sweet perfume radiating off her neck. "I had the wedding planners move your place card. You're at table 89. It's in the back corner, right next to the swinging kitchen doors and the service restrooms. It's where the waitstaff takes their breaks. I figured you'd feel much more comfortable back there with your own kind. Now, be a good little peasant, turn around, and get out of my sight before I have security escort you out of my wedding." She spun on her heels, her massive train whipping across the imported marble, and ascended the stairs to her throne, laughing with her bridesmaids as if she had just swatted away a bothersome fly. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't cause a scene. I simply stood there in the glittering light of the ballroom, feeling a profound, terrifyingly cold sense of clarity wash over my entire soul. Chloe thought she was banishing a weak, pathetic, poor old woman to the shadows. She thought she was the queen of the castle. What my arrogant daughter-in-law and my cowardly son didn't know, what nobody in this glittering, fake room knew, was that I didn't just pay for the flowers. I didn't just pay for the catering. Through a network of private equity shell companies I had spent the last 2 decades ruthlessly building from nothing, I owned the St. Regis Grand Hotel. I owned the chandeliers. I owned the marble floors. I owned the very ground they were standing on. I slowly reached into my small clutch, pulled out my phone, and opened a direct encrypted message to the hotel's general manager, a man who answered only to me. I typed a single sentence: "Execute Protocol 0. Now." Tonight, they weren't going to just lose their VIP table. They were going to lose absolutely everything. Before we go any further, before I tell you exactly how I hit the send button on that message and completely annihilated Chloe's pathetic, superficial empire in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in the city, I need to pause for a moment. I need to step out of that ballroom and talk directly to you. Yes, you. I know exactly why you clicked on this video. I know the heavy, suffocating weight you carry in your chest. I know what it feels like to stand in a room full of people who share your blood or who married into your bloodline and realize that to them, you are absolutely nothing. You are a resource. You are a punching bag. You are an ATM, a stepping stone, or a convenient shadow they can use to make themselves look brighter. You know the exact sting of that betrayal, don't you? You know what it's like to sacrifice your youth, your energy, and your bank account to build a life for someone else, only to have them look down their nose at you the moment they think they've outgrown you. You know the deafening, heartbreaking silence of a family member, a son, a daughter, a sibling, or a parent who stands by and watches you get humiliated, simply because they are too cowardly to defend the person who gave them everything. Society brainwashes us from the moment we are born. They drill this toxic, insidious lie into our heads. Blood is thicker than water. Family is everything. You have to forgive them. They're family. Let me tell you something right now, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. Blood does not equal a blank check. Sharing DNA or a marriage certificate does not give anyone the right to emotionally abuse you, disrespect your boundaries, or treat you like a peasant in a kingdom you helped build. Disrespect is disrespect, whether it comes from a stranger on the street or the son you carried for 9 months. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever had to swallow your tears, bite your tongue, and smile through the agonizing pain of being the family scapegoat, I need you to do something for me right now. I want you to scroll down and hit that like button. Obliterate it. Hit it as a digital declaration of war against every single toxic narcissist who ever made you feel small. Let that like button be the boundary you wish you had set years ago. And right now, I want to know exactly who is standing in this army of survivors with me. Tell me in the comments down below. Where are you watching this from? Are you tuning in from the bustling streets of New York City, the quiet suburbs of London, the beautiful coasts of Australia, or a small town where everyone knows your name? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see the global map of people who are waking up, taking their power back and refusing to be victims any longer. If you have ever had to look a toxic family member dead in the eye and teach them a lesson they will carry with them to their grave, I want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments, your survival story, your moment of walking away. Might be the exact spark of courage someone else needs to read tonight to finally pack their bags and leave their own abusive situation. And most importantly, if you are ready to stop apologizing for your success, stop shrinking to make mediocre people comfortable, and start building a life of absolute, untouchable peace, you need to hit that subscribe button. By subscribing to this channel, you are joining an elite community of self-made, fiercely independent people who prioritize their mental health and their financial freedom over toxic family loyalty. We do not negotiate with emotional terrorists. We do not beg for a seat at the table. We buy the entire building and evict the people who disrespected us. Make sure you ring that notification bell, because the story I am about to finish is going to be the most satisfying, emotionally cathartic masterclass in revenge you have ever witnessed. You saw Chloe smirking in her custom-beaded gown. You saw my son turn his head and take a sip of his whiskey. They thought they had backed a tired, poor old woman into a corner. They thought they had permanently banished me to the shadows next to the swinging kitchen doors. But what they didn't realize is that when you push a self-made woman into the dark, you don't break her. You simply give her the perfect cover to meticulously plot your complete and utter destruction. Let's go back to the ballroom. It's time to teach the bride a lesson about who really owns the throne. To truly understand the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the mistake my daughter-in-law had just made, and to comprehend the ice running through my veins as I stood in that suffocatingly opulent ballroom, you have to understand the soil from which this entire toxic family tree grew. You have to look back long before the baccarat crystal and the imported white hydrangeas. You have to rewind the clock back to a sprawling, decaying 4,000-square-foot McMansion in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut. It was a house built entirely on smoke, mirrors, and crushing credit card debt. I was not born into wealth. I was born into the illusion of it. My parents, Beatrice and Richard, were the architects of a meticulously crafted, utterly hollow facade. They were obsessed, to a clinical degree, with image, status, and the perception of old money. My father was a mid-level regional manager for a paper supply company, yet he walked, talked, and dressed as if he were a senior partner at a Wall Street hedge fund. He spoke exclusively in the language of golf handicaps, vintage Rolex models he couldn't afford, and name-dropping men who didn't even know his last name. My mother, Beatrice, was a terrifying force of nature. She was a woman who possessed a spine of pure titanium, but a soul as cheap and manufactured as cubic zirconia. Her entire existence revolved around the Wellington Country Club, the charity galas, the tennis luncheons, the vicious, whispered gossip over heavily poured martinis. To the outside world, my parents were the picture of suburban aristocratic perfection. But behind the heavy oak doors of our home, the reality was a suffocating nightmare of financial terror and psychological abuse. And at the absolute dead center of this toxic, swirling vortex of dysfunction was my younger brother, Preston. Preston was the undisputed, universally worshipped golden child. From the moment he took his first breath, my parents looked at him as the second coming of royalty. He was blessed with my father's sharp, Kennedy-esque jawline and my mother's piercing blue eyes, and they treated his physical appearance as a substitute for character, intelligence, or basic human decency. The double standard in our household was not just apparent. It was a physical weight that threatened to snap my spine on a daily basis. When Preston turned 16, Despite having straight D grades and a burgeoning authority problem, my parents threw a lavish driveway reveal party and presented him with the keys to a brand new, leased BMW 3 Series. They popped champagne, took dozens of photos for their country club friends, and heralded him as a prodigy destined for greatness. When I turned 16, having maintained a flawless 4.0 GPA while simultaneously working a part-time job at a local diner just to afford my own winter coat, my mother handed me a plastic bus pass and a list of household chores. "You're not the glamorous type, Eleanor," she had told me on the morning of my birthday, sipping her black coffee and casually looking me up and down with an expression of mild distaste. "Preston has the charm. He's going to be a CEO. He needs the right optics. You, on the other hand, well, you're sturdy. You have a good work ethic. You're going to be a wonderful support system for this family." A support system. That was the exact moment my role in the family was permanently cemented. I was not a daughter. I was not a human being with dreams, ambitions, or a right to my own life. I was the designated workhorse. I was the scapegoat. I was the invisible, heavily burdened mule expected to pull the carriage while the rest of them rode inside, drinking champagne and complaining about the bumps in the road. As we grew into adulthood, the financial rot of my parents' lifestyle began to eat through the floorboards. The country club dues went unpaid. The mortgage slipped into arrears. And Preston, the supposed prodigy, completely failed to launch. He dropped out of 3 different private universities, racked up 6 figures in gambling and nightlife debts, and floated from one delusional tech startup to another, funding his entrepreneurial journey with my parents' dwindling retirement accounts. And when the banks finally came knocking, threatening to foreclose on the precious Connecticut mansion and strip away the only thing my parents cared about, their public image, they didn't look to the golden child for help. They looked to the mule. By my late 20s, I had quietly started a modest logistics management company. I was working 90-hour weeks, sleeping on the floor of a rented warehouse, negotiating contracts, and ruthlessly grinding my way into a notoriously male-dominated industry. I made my first million by the time I was 29, but I made a brilliant, life-saving decision. I never told my family. I knew that if Beatrice and Richard discovered I had real wealth, they would descend upon me like starving vultures. They would drain every single drop of blood I had sacrificed to build my company, and they would hand it straight to Preston. So, I played the part they assigned me. To them, I was just a mid-level accountant. I wore modest, sensible clothes. I drove a 10-year-old reliable sedan. I lived in a simple, unremarkable townhouse. But behind the scenes, I was a titan in the making. I was acquiring commercial real estate. I was buying up failing supply chains, restructuring them, and flipping them for massive profits. I created an intricate web of private equity shell companies, Obsidian Holdings, Aegis Properties, Vanguard Management, to mask my identity and aggressively expand my empire. Yet the emotional conditioning of a toxic childhood runs deep. Even as a multi-millionaire hiding in plain sight, I still fell victim to their manipulation. Every time my mother called, weeping hysterically about how the electricity was going to be shut off, or how Preston needed just one more bailout to avoid criminal charges for a bounced check, the ingrained guilt would override my logic. I became their secret ATM. I quietly paid off the mortgage on the Connecticut house, funneling it through a fake debt relief program so they wouldn't know it was me. I settled Preston's lawsuits. I funded the very illusion that kept them feeling superior to me. "It's the least you can do, Eleanor," my father would sneer at Thanksgiving dinners, completely unaware that the turkey on his plate and the roof over his head were paid for by my hidden empire. "You don't have a husband. You don't have Preston's charisma. Family takes care of family. I took the abuse. I swallowed the poison. I smiled through the agonizing disrespect because I believed, foolishly, that if I just kept them afloat, if I just proved my usefulness, they would eventually love me. But the final, fatal wound, the one that irreparably shattered my soul and set the stage for tonight's absolute destruction, was how they weaponized my only son, David. Because I was working around the clock to build an empire and secretly fund my family's toxic lifestyle, I had to rely heavily on my parents to help watch David after his father passed away. It was the greatest regret of my life. Beatrice and Richard didn't just babysit David. They indoctrinated him. They raised him in the echo chamber of their country club delusions. They taught him that money, status, and the brand names on his clothing were the only true measures of a man's worth. They subtly, relentlessly poisoned him against me, painting me as a drab, boring, uncultured workaholic who simply didn't understand the finer things in life. And then David met Chloe. Chloe was a younger, louder, even more venomous version of my mother. When David brought her home, my parents practically fell to their knees in worship. Chloe came from new money, though most of it was leveraged in high-interest debt, and she spoke the exact language of superficiality that my family adored. Instantly, Chloe, David, Beatrice, Richard, and the perpetually useless Preston formed a tight, impenetrable inner circle. They went on luxurious vacations, which I subsidized through a trust fund they thought my late husband had left. They dined at Michelin star restaurants. They bonded over their shared arrogance. And I was completely pushed to the outside. The ultimate humiliating irony. I was the silent engine powering their entire existence, and they treated me like the dirt beneath their designer shoes. The planning of this wedding had been a grueling, year-long campaign of psychological torture. Chloe had mocked every suggestion I made. She had scoffed at my middle-class tastes. And when the final bill for the St. Regis Grand Hotel came due, a staggering, mind-numbing sum of $350,000, my son David actually had the audacity to call me and demand I take out a second mortgage on my modest townhouse to pay for it. Chloe deserves the best, Mom. You've never really understood high society. Just write the check. Consider it your final obligation to me before I start my real life with her family. Those were his exact words. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply agreed. What David didn't know was that he didn't need to write a check to the St. Regis. I had secretly purchased the entire historic property through Obsidian Holdings 3 years prior. I owned the catering company. I owned the floral distribution network. The massive discount they thought they negotiated with the hotel's general manager was actually a direct order from me, pulling the strings from the shadows, setting the trap perfectly in place. Which brings us back to the present moment, back to the freezing cold, diamond-cut reality of the ballroom. I stood at the bottom of the velvet-lined stairs. I looked past Chloe's sneering face. I looked past my son's cowardly, averted gaze. And I looked directly at the rest of the VIP head table. Sitting there, sipping vintage champagne and laughing at my public humiliation, were my parents, Beatrice and Richard, and my golden child brother, Preston. They had been given the seats of honor. They were basking in the glow of the flashing cameras, reveling in the fact that the family scapegoat had finally been put in her place. They thought this was their crowning moment of triumph. They thought they had finally won. They thought they had successfully drained the mule dry, used her to fund the greatest social event of the decade, and cast her out into the cold where she belonged. They had absolutely no idea that the silent, sturdy workhorse they had abused for 40 years was actually the executioner, and the blade was already swinging down. I slipped my phone back into my small, understated clutch. The soft, metallic click of the clasp snapping shut was the only sound that registered in my mind. To the untrained eye, I was just a defeated, middle-aged woman standing frozen at the edge of a glittering dance floor. But internally, the tectonic plates of my universe had just violently shifted. I did not turn around and walk to table 89. I did not drop my head in shame. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, my hands relaxed at my sides, and waited. Up at the sprawling, velvet-draped VIP table, the toxic theater of my family was in full swing. My mother, Beatrice, caught my eye from across the room. She was practically dripping in cubic zirconia she passed off as heirloom diamonds. Instead of looking horrified at how her daughter-in-law had just treated me, Beatrice leaned over to my father, whispered something behind her hand, and let out a vicious, glittering little laugh. My brother, Preston, the 30-something man-child whose entire existence I had secretly bankrolled, raised his champagne flute in my direction. A mocking, sarcastic toast to the family mule finally being put out to pasture. And then there was Chloe. Basking in the glow of her perceived victory, she tapped a silver fork against her baccarat crystal flute. Clink, clink, clink. The soft murmur of the ballroom fell to a hush. The string quartet elegantly faded out. Chloe stood up, adjusting the heavy bodice of her custom gown, and grabbed the wireless microphone resting on the table. She looked out over the 300 wealthy, influential guests, her eyes gleaming with narcissistic delight. "Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight," Chloe purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "David and I are just so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by people of such caliber. Blending families is never easy, especially when you come from such different backgrounds and, let's just say, different levels of sophistication. But tonight is about celebrating the future, a future of success, high society, and surrounding ourselves with people who truly understand what it means to build a legacy." She shot a brief, razor-sharp glance in my direction. Several of her bridesmaids giggled. David stared intensely at his linen napkin, a coward hiding in a tuxedo. "So," Chloe continued, raising her glass high, "to the new king and queen of the castle." "Hear, hear," Preston shouted from the end of the table. As the guests raised their glasses and the ballroom erupted into a polite, wealthy applause, a heavy, unmistakable sound echoed from the back of the room. Thud. The massive, 20-foot-tall, solid oak doors of the ballroom slammed open. The applause faltered. Heads turned. Chloe lowered her glass, a flash of genuine annoyance crossing her perfectly contoured face. Standing in the doorway was Marcus Vance, the general manager of the St. Regis Grand. Marcus was a man of terrifying efficiency, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, carrying an aura of absolute authority. But he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 6 large men in identical black suits with earpieces, the hotel's elite private security detail. Behind them, a line of the hotel's senior executive staff stood at rigid attention. Marcus raised his hand and snapped his fingers once. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. Instantly, the entire atmosphere of the room violently shifted. The warm, golden, romantic ambient lighting abruptly clicked off, replaced by the stark, blindingly bright fluorescent house lights. The illusion of the fairy tale aesthetic vanished in a split second, exposing every harsh shadow and imperfection in the room. The waitstaff, who had been moving gracefully among the tables pouring vintage Bordeaux, immediately stopped. In perfect unison, they placed their wine bottles on the nearest tables, took 2 steps back, and folded their hands behind their backs. The chefs manning the carving stations in the corner shut off the heat lamps and stepped away. Protocol Zero was not just a cancellation. It was a complete, systematic withdrawal of every single luxury service in the building. "What is going on?" Chloe shrieked into the microphone, the feedback whining loudly through the speakers. "Who turned on the house lights? Turn them back on right now! Where is the catering director?" Marcus Vance ignored her completely. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, his leather shoes clicking against the imported Italian marble. He didn't look at the confused billionaires, the shocked socialites, or the panicked bride. He walked directly toward me. When he reached the edge of the dance floor where I was standing, the general manager of the most prestigious hotel in the city stopped, squared his shoulders, and bowed his head in a display of profound, unmistakable reverence. "Madam CEO," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silent room. "Protocol 0 has been initiated. The property is secured. The staff has been ordered to stand down, awaiting your final instructions." He extended his hands, offering me a thick black leather folio embossed with the gold crest of Obsidian Holdings. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating physical weight. 300 people stopped breathing at exactly the same time. I took the folio from Marcus. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside. I slowly lifted my chin and looked up at the VIP table. The smug, arrogant sneers had completely vanished from my family's faces, replaced by a pale, sickening terror. My mother looked as if she had just been struck by lightning. Preston's champagne flute was frozen halfway to his mouth. Chloe's jaw was unhinged, the microphone trembling in her manicured hand. I took my first step onto the velvet-lined stairs of the dais. I didn't rush. I didn't yell. I walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy grace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. I walked past the imported white hydrangeas. I walked past the baccarat crystal. I stopped directly in front of the bride and my son. I reached out, and with a gentle, terrifying calmness, I pulled the microphone out of Chloe's paralyzed hand. "A king and queen of the castle," I said, my voice echoing off the 60-foot ceilings, cold and sharp as shattered glass. "What a beautiful sentiment, Chloe. But there is a fundamental flaw in your little fairy tale." I looked out at the sea of terrified guests, then directly into the camera of the wedding videographer, who was still desperately recording every second. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly behind the head table, "to be the queen of the castle, you actually have to own it. You thought you were banishing a poor, pathetic, middle-class mother to the shadows. You thought your new money and your massive credit card debt made you untouchable." I stopped behind my parents. My mother, Beatrice, was physically trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth. "For 40 years, I was the joke of this family," I said, my voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a lifetime of suppressed rage. "I was the uncultured workhorse. I was the sturdy mule meant to pull the carriage while you all drank champagne." I dropped the leather folio onto the table in front of my father. It landed with a heavy, deafening thud. "You didn't know that the debt relief program that magically paid off the mortgage on your Connecticut mansion 3 years ago was me. I own your house, Richard. The deed is in that folder." My father let out a choked, pathetic gasp. I kept walking, stopping behind my golden child brother. He shrank into his chair, refusing to make eye contact. "And Preston," I whispered into the microphone, leaning down so my lips were inches from his ear. "Those angel investors who bailed out your last 3 failed startups? That was Vanguard Management, one of my shell companies. You don't have a business, Preston. You have a very expensive allowance, funded entirely by the sister you just toasted to throwing away." I finally turned and faced Chloe and David. My son looked entirely shattered, a hollow shell of a man realizing his entire reality was a fabricated lie. Chloe's face was flushed a deep, violent crimson, tears of pure humiliation pooling in her eyes. "And as for this wedding," I said, my eyes locking onto Chloe's, "you mocked my clothes. You mocked my taste. You banished me to the swinging doors of the kitchen because I didn't fit your aesthetic. You told my son to force me to take out a second mortgage to pay the massive bill for this venue." I raised my free hand and gestured to the soaring ceilings, the massive chandeliers, and the marble floors. "I didn't take out a second mortgage, David," I said, looking at my son with absolute, icy finality. "Because I didn't need to. 3 years ago, my private equity firm, Obsidian Holdings, purchased the St. Regis Grand in a private acquisition. I own the catering company. I own the floral distribution network. I own the chair you are sitting on, Chloe. I own the ground beneath your feet." Chloe let out a whimpering, pathetic sob, shrinking back into her seat as the sheer magnitude of her mistake crushed the air out of her lungs. "Blood does not equal a blank check," I declared to the entire room, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "And disrespect will no longer be subsidized by my bank account." I turned to Marcus, who was standing perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs. "Mr. Vance," I commanded.
"Yes, Madam CEO?"
"The charity is over. The charity is over." Those 5 words did not just echo through the cavernous 60-foot-tall ballroom. They struck the Vipe table like a localized, devastating seismic event. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in an agonizing, razor-thin silence, the kind of breathless vacuum that immediately precedes a catastrophic explosion. Then, the absolute destruction began. Marcus Vance, a man who possessed the cold, mechanical efficiency of a military general, did not hesitate. He raised his hand to his earpiece, nodded once, and barked a single, crisp command. "Commence venue liquidation. Clear the floor." What? From the swinging kitchen doors at the back of the room, the exact same doors Chloe had gleefully banished me to just 15 minutes prior, an army of the hotel's unionized staff marched in. There were no longer servers carrying silver platters. These were the heavy-duty operations teams. Men and women dressed in stark black utility uniforms flooded the imported Italian marble floor. At a nearby table, an older billionaire from a prominent tech firm simply leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and watched with a grin of absolute, unadulterated amusement as 2 burly staff members unceremoniously gripped the edges of his table's heavily embroidered white velvet tablecloth. "Excuse me, sir," one of the workers said politely. All across the room, the fairy tale aesthetic was being violently ripped apart under the harsh, sterile glare of the fluorescent house lights. The caterers moved from table to table, silently retrieving the plates of half-eaten imported caviar and Wagyu beef right out from under the forks of the stunned guests. The string quartet had already packed their instruments and were quietly slipping out a side exit. The illusion was dead. The magic was gone. Up on the velvet-draped dais, the panic was no longer simmering. It was boiling over into a full-blown, psychological meltdown. My mother, Beatrice, was the first to completely break. The heavy, cubic zirconia necklace she wore seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds, dragging her posture down until she looked like a frail, terrified old woman. She frantically turned to the crowd, her eyes wide and manic, desperately searching the sea of 300 elite guests for a single sympathetic face among her country club friends. This is a misunderstanding!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "Eleanor is having a nervous breakdown! Someone call a doctor! Richard, do something! Tell them who we are!" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply tapped the heavy black leather folio I had dropped in front of my father. "Tell them who you are, Richard?" I asked, my tone dripping with lethal calmness. I leaned forward, resting both hands on the crisp white tablecloth. Go ahead. Open the folder. Tell them that the man who spent the last 20 years bragging about his stock portfolio and looking down on his daughter's mediocre lifestyle has exactly $412 in his checking account. Tell them that the only reason you haven't been sleeping on the streets of Connecticut is because I bought your foreclosed mortgage from the bank. Richard's hands shook violently as he flipped open the heavy leather cover. His eyes darted across the topmost document, a formal, legally binding notice of eviction, fully executed and notarized, drafted by the elite legal team at Obsidian Holdings. No, Richard wheezed, his face draining of all color until it matched the white linen of his tuxedo shirt. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, childlike terror. Eleanor, you can't. You can't do this. We're your parents. We're family. Where will we go? You should have thought about that before you sat at this table and laughed while your daughter-in-law publicly humiliated the woman who kept the roof over your head, I replied, my voice as cold as absolute zero. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the property. My property. The locks will be changed on Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. If you are still inside, you will be removed for trespassing. Beatrice let out a guttural, horrifying wail, burying her face in her hands, her carefully sprayed hair falling loose around her shoulders in a tangled mess. The country club queen had officially been dethroned. But I wasn't finished. I slowly turned my gaze to the end of the table. Preston, the 30-something golden child, the perpetual failure, the boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter while I was handed a bus pass. He was frantically typing on his smartphone, his thumbs moving at lightning speed, sweat beading heavily on his forehead. Call them back! Preston hissed frantically into his phone, having just dialed his business partner. What do you mean Vanguard pulled the funding? What do you mean the accounts are frozen? Call the bank! I reached into my pocket, pulled out my own smartphone, and gently tapped the screen. I held it up so Preston could see it. Displayed on my screen was the administrative control panel for Vanguard Management's commercial accounts. They can't call the bank, Preston, I said softly, a dark, victorious smile finally touching the corners of my lips. Because Vanguard Management is not just your angel investor. It's the parent company of your entire pathetic tech startup. And as the majority shareholder, I just executed a hostile liquidation of all assets. Your company no longer exists. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your credit cards have been canceled. Preston dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the china plates. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish that had just been dragged out of the ocean and thrown onto a burning dock. As if perfectly cued by the universe, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. A young man in a red valet uniform practically sprinted into the room, looking frantically around before spotting the head table. He jogged up the center aisle, holding a yellow slip of paper. "Excuse me, Mr. Preston Vance?" the valet called out, breathless. Preston stared at him, paralyzed. "Sir," the valet continued, completely oblivious to the sheer destruction happening around him. "I'm so sorry, but a Lincoln towing flatbed just pulled up to the front circle. They have a repossession order for the 2024 Porsche 911. They've already hooked it up. They asked me to give you this slip." A wave of cruel, undeniable laughter rippled through the audience. The elite guests, the real billionaires and power players of the city, were no longer just watching. They were actively enjoying the spectacular downfall of a family of frauds. Preston shrank into his chair, pulling at the collar of his tuxedo as if it were suddenly choking him. He hid his face behind his hands, wishing the floor would simply open up and swallow him whole. Then came the grand finale. Chloe, the bride, the architect of her own demise. the woman who had demanded I take out a second mortgage to fund her delusions of grandeur. Chloe was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved violently beneath the heavy, custom-beaded bodice of her gown. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, dark tracks of mascara running down her cheeks like war paint. She looked out at the ballroom, at the empty tables, the staff rolling away the massive floral arrangements, the guests pointing and whispering. Her perfect, Instagram-worthy dream wedding was being dismantled, piece by piece, right before her eyes. "Stop!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She slammed both hands onto the table and stood up, glaring at Marcus Vance. "I am the bride. I demand you stop this right now. Turn the lights back on. Bring the food back. My father is a very powerful man. He will sue this hotel into bankruptcy. He will buy this entire building and fire every single one of you." From table number 2, right at the front of the dance floor, Chloe's father, Arthur, a man who looked as though he had spent too much time in tanning beds and not enough time reading his own balance sheets, leapt to his feet. He puffed out his chest and marched toward the dais, looking ready to unleash a tirade of legal threats.
"See here, Eleanor,"
Arthur barked, pointing a thick, gold-ringed finger at me. "I don't know what kind of psychotic break you're having, but you cannot ruin my daughter's wedding. I have spent a fortune on this event. I will ruin you." I didn't even look at Arthur. I kept my eyes locked on Chloe. I raised 2 fingers in the air. Immediately, Marcus Vance stepped forward. He didn't carry a leather folio this time. He carried a single, crisp, white sheet of paper on a silver platter. He walked down the velvet steps, intercepted Arthur halfway, and held the platter out to him.
"What the hell is this?"
Arthur spat, snatching the paper off the silver tray. "That, Arthur," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the microphone I still held in my hand, "is the final itemized invoice for tonight's event, including the venue rental, the catering, the imported flowers, the open bar, and the private security detail. The grand total comes to exactly $354,200. Arthur scoffed, waving the paper in the air. "I don't care what it costs. I'll write a check right now." "Will you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the dais, looking down at the red-faced man. "That's fascinating, Arthur. Because according to the comprehensive financial background check my corporate acquisitions team ran on your highly successful real estate firm last week, you are currently leveraged in $12 million of high-interest commercial debt. You have missed your last 3 mortgage payments on your primary residence. Your corporate credit line was suspended on Tuesday. If you try to write a check for $350,000 tonight, it will bounce so hard it will trigger a federal fraud investigation." The color drained from Arthur's face so fast he looked as though he might pass out. The blustering, arrogant father of the bride instantly deflated, his shoulders sagging, the piece of paper trembling in his hand. He looked up at his daughter, his eyes filled with absolute defeat, and slowly shook his head. "Dad?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Dad, what is she talking about? Tell her she's lying. Tell her to turn the lights back on." Arthur didn't answer. He simply turned around, ignoring his daughter's pleas, and quietly walked back to his table, keeping his eyes glued to the marble floor. Chloe collapsed back into her chair. A high-pitched, keening sound escaped her throat, the sound of an ego completely, utterly shattering into a million pieces. She was no longer a queen. She was a deeply indebted, publicly humiliated fraud, sitting in a rented dress she likely couldn't afford, surrounded by 300 of the city's most powerful people who now knew exactly how broke she truly was. And then, finally, there was my son, David. Throughout the entire execution, David had remained frozen. He had watched his grandparents lose their home. He had watched his uncle lose his business. He had watched his new wife's entire reality collapse, and he had realized, with terrifying clarity, exactly who was holding the sledgehammer. He slowly stood up. He didn't look like the smug, arrogant groom who had sneered at me 20 minutes ago. He looked like a scared, pathetic little boy. "Mom," David whispered. The microphone picked up the quiet, trembling desperation in his voice. "Mom, please, stop. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know you owned all of this. I didn't know you paid for everything." I turned slowly to face my only child. The boy I had carried, the boy I had bled for, the boy who had chosen the allure of fake wealth and a toxic, venomous woman over the mother who gave him life. I looked at him, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no love, no maternal instinct. The space in my heart where my son used to reside had completely calcified, turning into cold, impenetrable stone. "You didn't know?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper that commanded the absolute attention of every single soul in the room. "You didn't know I owned the hotel? So you thought it was acceptable to let your wife banish me to the kitchen? You didn't know I was a billionaire, so you thought it was perfectly fine to demand I take out a second mortgage to pay for this absurd spectacle."
No, Mom, that's not what I meant.
David pleaded, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his perfectly shaved cheeks. He reached a hand out toward me across the table. "I love you. You're my mother. I was just stressed. Chloe was stressed. We can fix this. Please, just tell them to turn the lights back on. Tell them to bring the food back. We can sit together. You can sit right here next to me." He patted the empty, velvet-covered chair beside him, the chair he had previously denied me. I stared at that empty chair for a long, heavy moment. Then, I looked back at the tear-stained, pathetic face of the man I used to call my son. "I don't want the chair, David," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, a sterile, surgical strike directly to his core. "And I don't want you." David flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. "You thought my wealth was a secret inheritance waiting for you," I continued, speaking slowly, making sure every single syllable etched itself permanently into his memory. "You thought that no matter how horribly you treated me, no matter how much you disrespected me, you could just wait me out and collect the check when I died. Well, let me make this abundantly clear to you, David, in front of your new wife, your toxic family, and everyone in this room." I leaned in, my eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "There is no trust fund. There is no inheritance. As of 6 p.m. this evening, the exact moment you stood at that altar and made your vows to a woman who openly despises me, I had my legal team completely restructure my estate. Every single asset, every company, every property, and every dollar I have ever made is being transferred into an irrevocable philanthropic trust." David let out a choked gasp, his hand flying to his mouth. "You are completely cut off," I stated, the finality of the words ringing like a heavy iron bell. "You have your new superficial family now. You have your bankrupt father-in-law. You have your heavily indebted wife. You can all live together in the shallow, pathetic little world you created. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my home. Do not ever speak my name again. You are nothing to me." I reached forward, gently placed the wireless microphone on the table next to the ruined, half-eaten wedding cake, and took a deliberate step back. The silence in the room was absolute. The 300 elite guests were completely motionless, utterly captivated by the raw, undisputed display of power they had just witnessed. The string quartet was gone. The catering staff stood completely still along the walls. The only sound in the massive 60-foot ballroom was the pathetic, quiet sobbing of my son and his ruined bride. They were financially obliterated. They were socially destroyed. They were completely, permanently broken. And my vengeance was finally complete. I did not wait for a response from the crying boy who used to be my son. I did not linger to watch the mascara run down Chloe's face, nor did I stay to listen to my mother's hysterical, pathetic wailing as she realized she was officially homeless. When you are the apex predator, you do not need to stick around to watch the scavengers fight over the scraps. The kill has already been made. I slowly turned my back on the sprawling, velvet-draped VIP table. The physical sensation of that single movement, the simple act of pivoting my body 180 degrees away from the people who shared my DNA, was the most profound, violently liberating experience of my entire life. For 40 years, my shoulders had been permanently bowed under the suffocating, crushing gravity of their expectations. For 40 years, I had carried the psychological boulder of their fake image, their debts, their cruelty, and their endless, parasitic demands. But in that one defining second, as I turned away, I felt the invisible steel chains snapping off my wrists and shattering onto the imported Italian marble floor. I took my first step down from the dais. Click. The sound of my modest, sensible navy heel striking the marble echoed through the absolute, dead silence of the cavernous ballroom. It was no longer the sound of a tired, middle-class accountant scurrying to the back of the room to hide. It was the heavy, rhythmic, undeniable strike of a titan claiming her territory. Click. I took a second step. The air in the room had completely changed. Just 20 minutes ago, the atmosphere had been thick with the suffocating scent of expensive, artificial perfumes and the arrogant, mocking laughter of high society looking down on a perceived peasant. Now, the air was sharp, sterile and biting under the harsh glare of the fluorescent house lights. It smelled of ozone, adrenaline, and the absolute, unadulterated terror of the 300 elite guests who were currently paralyzed in their seats. I reached the bottom of the stairs and began to walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. It was a cinematic, almost surreal parting of the sea. The wealthiest, most influential power players in the city, hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and old money socialites, physically shrank back as I approached. These were people who normally commanded rooms, people who fired executives for sport before their morning coffee. Yet, as I walked past them, they pulled their chairs in. They lowered their eyes. They instinctively made way for a power they could not comprehend, a silent, lethal force that had just publicly eviscerated a family without raising her voice above a conversational hum. I walked past table 2, where Arthur, the bankrupt father of the bride, sat slumped in his chair. He was staring blankly at the white tablecloth, his face a sickening shade of gray, the itemized invoice for $350,000 crumpled in his trembling fist. He didn't even look up as my shadow passed over him. He was a broken man, a ghost haunting his own daughter's ruined wedding. I walked past the tech billionaire who had laughed as the centerpieces were rolled away. As I drew near, he slowly stood up from his chair. He didn't speak a word, but he lifted his crystal water glass in a solemn, respectful salute, a silent acknowledgement from one titan of industry to another. I gave him a microscopic, barely perceptible nod in return and kept walking. Click, click, click. My pace was slow, deliberate, and exquisitely agonizing for the people left behind. Every single step I took away from that head table was a permanent severance of a toxic bond. With my left foot, I stepped away from the ghost of the 16-year-old girl who was handed a plastic bus pass, while her brother was handed the keys to a BMW. With my right foot, I stepped away from the exhausted 20-something entrepreneur who slept on the freezing concrete floor of a rented warehouse, desperately building an empire just to secretly pay off her parents' country club debts so they wouldn't stop loving her. With every stride, the mule was dying, and the absolute, untouchable CEO was cementing her reign. I reached the massive 20-foot-tall solid oak doors at the back of the ballroom. A line of the St. Regis's elite private security detail stood at rigid attention, their hands folded perfectly behind their backs. As I approached, they stepped forward in perfect military-like unison and pulled the heavy brass handles, pulling the doors wide open to grant me exit. I stepped out of the chaotic, fluorescent-lit ruin of the ballroom and into the breathtaking, hushed sanctuary of the hotel's grand foyer. The contrast was staggering. Out here, in my domain, everything was perfectly controlled. The lighting was a soft, warm amber. The air was perfumed with the signature St. Regis scent of white tea and fig. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the magnificent cascading crystal chandeliers above. This was the empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. This was the castle they thought they could banish me from. Marcus Vance, the general manager, had silently followed me out of the ballroom. He stood a respectful 3 paces behind me, holding the black leather folio containing the eviction notices and the liquidation papers. I stopped in the center of the foyer and took a deep, cleansing breath of the conditioned air. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice low and smooth, completely devoid of the adrenaline that was surely still spiking in the room behind me. "Yes, Madam CEO," Marcus replied instantly, his tone perfectly even. "You are to ensure that the evacuation of the ballroom is completed within the next 10 minutes. I want the caterers out, the floral arrangements completely stripped, and the doors locked." "Understood, madam." "As for the VIP table," I continued, adjusting the strap of my modest clutch on my shoulder, "you will not provide them with an escort. You will not offer them a private exit. They are to walk out through the main lobby, past the remaining guests, and out the front doors like everyone else. If the bride attempts to cause a scene or damage any hotel property, you have my full authorization to contact local law enforcement and have her arrested for trespassing and vandalism." "It will be handled with extreme prejudice, madam." Marcus nodded, a slight approving glint in his eye. "And Marcus?" I turned to look at him directly. "Yes?" "Cancel the suite reservations for the Vance family and the bride's family. They are no longer welcome on this property. If they try to access the elevators, have security physically remove them." "Consider it done. Have a peaceful evening, madam." I gave him a brief nod and turned toward the grand revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby. As I pushed through the glass and stepped out onto the sprawling circular cobblestone driveway of the hotel, the cool, crisp night air hit my face. It was a perfect cloudless evening. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a glittering sea of diamonds against the pitch-black canvas of the night sky. The chaotic, blaring noise of downtown traffic was a low, comforting hum. The head valet, a sharp young man in a pristine red uniform, saw me exit. He immediately recognized me, not as the mother of the groom, but as the woman whose private equity firm signed his paychecks. He raised a 2-way radio to his mouth, spoke a rapid command, and sprinted over to me. "Good evening, madam," he said, bowing his head respectfully. "Your vehicle is ready." From the subterranean VIP garage beneath the hotel, a low, guttural, earth-shaking rumble echoed up the concrete ramp. It was a sound of pure, engineered dominance. A custom, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently up the ramp and pulled to a flawless stop on the cobblestones right in front of me. Its paint was so deep and flawless it looked like liquid obsidian. The massive, polished chrome grille gleamed under the hotel's exterior floodlights. It was a fortress of absolute luxury, a vehicle designed not just for transportation, but for complete, impenetrable isolation from the mediocrity of the outside world. The valet rushed forward and opened the heavy, coach-style rear door for me. Before I stepped inside, I paused. I turned around and looked back at the towering, majestic facade of the St. Regis Grand. Through the massive two-story arched windows of the ballroom on the second floor, I could see the chaotic, frantic silhouettes of people scrambling under the harsh fluorescent lights. I could faintly see the catering staff rolling away the massive, multi-tiered wedding cake. I could see the shadows of a family whose entire universe had just been reduced to ash. They were trapped in a hell of their own making. And I was standing on the outside, holding the only key, completely indifferent to their burning. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of malice, but a smile of profound, undeniable peace. I turned back, gathered the fabric of my simple navy gown, and slid into the cavernous, butter-soft white leather interior of the Rolls-Royce. The valet closed the heavy door behind me with a solid, vault-like thud, instantly cutting off all sound from the outside world. The cabin of the Phantom was a silent, beautifully lit sanctuary. The starlight headliner above me glowed softly. The air smelled of rich leather and expensive mahogany. "Where to this evening, ma'am?" my private driver asked from the front seat, his voice filtering through the intercom, connecting the partitioned cabin. "Take the scenic route along the coast, Thomas," I replied, sinking back into the plush, heated leather and closing my eyes. "Take as long as you want. We are in absolutely no rush." "Very good, ma'am." The massive engine purred, and the Rolls-Royce seamlessly pulled away from the curb, gliding onto the main avenue like a phantom ship slipping into the deep ocean. I opened my eyes and looked at the small, polished vanity mirror mounted on the pillar beside me. I looked at my own reflection. I didn't look like a tired, beaten-down scapegoat. I didn't look like a woman who had just lost her son. I looked like a queen who had finally realized she never needed the court's permission to wear her crown. I turned my head and looked out the heavily tinted rear window. I watched the imposing, glowing structure of the St. Regis Grand Hotel slowly shrink in the distance. The towering columns, the glittering chandeliers, and the tiny, frantic figures of the people I used to call family grew smaller and smaller, fading into the ambient light of the city. I watched them shrink until they were nothing more than a blurry speck on the horizon. And then, as the Rolls-Royce banked a smooth corner and merged onto the dark, open highway leading toward the coast, they vanished completely. They were gone. And for the first time in my entire existence, I was truly, completely, and utterly free. The midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently along the winding, moonlit curves of the Pacific Coast Highway, a solitary phantom moving through the darkness. Inside the cabin, I sat perfectly still, my head resting against the butter-soft white leather of the seat. For the first time in 40 years, my shoulders were entirely relaxed. The chronic, vibrating knot of anxiety that had lived at the base of my neck since childhood, the physical manifestation of waiting for the next crisis, the next demand for money, the next insult, was completely gone. It had simply evaporated the moment I walked out of the St. Regis Grand. We drove for over an hour, leaving the glittering, chaotic skyline of the city far behind. Eventually, Thomas, my driver, turned off the main highway onto a private, unmarked, heavily forested road. We drove for another 2 miles until we reached a set of massive, imposing wrought iron gates set into high limestone walls. This was Aegis Point, my true home. My family, in all their arrogant delusion, thought I lived in a beige, unremarkable townhouse in a middle-class suburb. They had no idea that 4 years ago, through one of my holding companies, I had purchased a 22-acre oceanfront compound. The heavy iron gates swung open smoothly, and the Phantom crunched onto the long, circular gravel driveway. As the car came to a stop, the exterior lights of the estate slowly illuminated. It was a masterpiece of modern, minimalist architecture. Glass, steel, and imported stone perched directly on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the crashing, untamed ocean below. There were no fake, imported hydrangeas here. There was no cheap, manufactured facade. There was only the raw, undeniable power of the sea, mirroring the absolute peace I had finally secured for myself. Thomas opened the door, and I stepped out into the cool, salt-laced night air. "Will you be needing anything else this evening, ma'am?" Thomas asked respectfully. "No, Thomas," I replied, pulling my light cashmere shawl around my shoulders. "Take the weekend off. Enjoy the time with your family." "Thank you, ma'am. Good night." I walked up the floating slate steps and placed my hand on the biometric scanner beside the massive, solid mahogany front door. The lock clicked with a heavy, satisfying thud, and I stepped inside. The silence of the house was not empty. It was rich, heavy, and profound. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand living room offered an unobstructed, panoramic view of the moon reflecting off the black ocean. I walked slowly through the house, kicking off my sensible navy heels, letting my bare feet sink into the plush, custom-woven rugs. I poured myself a single finger of incredibly rare, aged Japanese whiskey from the crystal decanter on my wet bar. I carried the glass out onto the sprawling, cantilevered terrace. The wind whipped through my hair, wild and untamed. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, took a slow, deliberate sip of the burning liquid, and allowed the absolute magnitude of the evening to finally wash over me. They were gone. The parasites had been completely detached from the host. For decades, I had allowed them to drain my life force because society had drilled a toxic narrative into my brain. They are your parents. He is your brother. He is your son. You owe them everything. I had bought into the illusion that my immense financial success was somehow a debt I had to continuously repay to a family that openly despised me. I had believed that if I just bought them enough things, saved them from enough bankruptcies, and swallowed enough of their cruel, mocking insults, they would eventually see my worth. But looking out at the dark, violently crashing waves, the ultimate truth crystallized in my mind. You cannot buy the love of a narcissist. You can only finance their delusions. And the longer you fund their fake reality, the more they will resent you for holding the purse strings. I finished my whiskey, went to my master suite, and slept for 10 uninterrupted, glorious hours. I did not dream of swinging kitchen doors, sneering brides, or the terrified faces of bankrupt men. I dreamed of absolute, untouchable peace. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was pouring through the massive windows, bathing the bedroom in a warm, golden light. I put on a plush white silk robe, walked into my state-of-the-art kitchen, and brewed a cup of black coffee. I picked up my encrypted smartphone from the Marble Island. To a normal person, waking up the morning after destroying your entire family would be a moment filled with dread, anticipating an avalanche of furious text messages and frantic voicemails. But my phone was perfectly, beautifully silent. I had already instructed my telecommunications security team to permanently block every single number, email address, and social media account associated with my former family. They existed behind an impenetrable digital wall. Instead, there was a single, highly detailed email waiting for me from Marcus Vance, the general manager of the St. Regis, along with a secondary report from the legal team at Obsidian Holdings. I sat down at the heavy oak dining table, took a sip of my coffee, and opened the reports. The execution had been flawless. It was a masterclass in systematic corporate ruination. According to Marcus's timeline, the complete evacuation of the grand ballroom had been achieved in exactly 9 minutes. The 300 elite guests had flooded out into the lobby, whispering, pointing, and immediately pulling out their phones to text everyone in their social circles about the spectacular, humiliating collapse of the Vance and Kensington families. The social death of my mother and my daughter-in-law had been instantaneous and absolute. In high society, bankruptcy is a disease, and overnight, my family had become highly infectious. Marcus noted that Chloe, the ruined bride, had attempted to throw a physical tantrum in the main lobby, screaming at the valet to bring her father's car around. However, because Arthur's corporate credit accounts had been frozen by his heavily leveraged creditors the moment the news of his impending federal fraud investigation leaked, the luxury town car rental company had remotely disabled the vehicle's engine in the hotel driveway. Arthur, his sobbing daughter, and my completely shattered son were forced to stand on the curb in their ruined formal wear and wait 45 minutes for a standard, budget rideshare to pick them up, while the hotel's remaining guests watched them through the glass doors. But the legal report from Obsidian Holdings was the true masterpiece of justice. Item 1. The eviction of Beatrice and Richard Vance. My parents had not believed my 48-hour warning. They thought it was a bluff. They thought I would cool down and revert back to being the obedient, submissive mule. The report detailed that at exactly 8 a.m. on Monday morning, a team of private security contractors, accompanied by local county sheriffs, arrived at the sprawling Connecticut McMansion. My mother was reportedly in her silk pajamas, screaming at the officers that they were ruining her reputation in the neighborhood. They were escorted off the property with nothing but 3 small suitcases of clothing. The house was immediately boarded up, the locks changed, and a massive foreclosure auction sign was pounded into the perfectly manicured front lawn for all of her country club friends to see. With no savings, no assets, and 0 credit, my parents were currently residing in a 2-star motel off the interstate. Item 2. The liquidation of Preston Vance. The golden child's downfall was the swiftest. Without Vanguard Management secretly funding his tech startup, the illusion shattered instantly. His business partners, realizing they had been backing a fraud who was relying entirely on a shadow investor, immediately filed lawsuits against him for gross negligence and misappropriation of funds. Furthermore, the repossession of his 2024 Porsche 911 at the wedding was just the beginning. The private investigators I had hired discovered he had secretly taken out a massive, high-interest loan against my parents' house, the house I actually owned. When the bank realized the collateral was fraudulent, they filed criminal charges. Preston was currently facing 3 counts of wire fraud, and was reportedly begging his former fraternity brothers to let him sleep on their couches. Item 3. The complete severance of David. The irrevocable philanthropic trust had been finalized and executed exactly as I promised. My entire multi-billion-dollar estate was legally locked down. David was completely, permanently cut off. The report noted that David had attempted to show up at my old, modest townhouse, only to find it completely empty, having been sold to a lovely young couple 3 days prior. He had no way to contact me. He was legally married to a woman whose father was facing federal bankruptcy, and he had absolutely no safety net to fall back on. I set the phone down on the table. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. I simply looked out at the ocean, feeling the warm morning sun on my face. The absolute finality of the situation washed over me like a cleansing tide. The cancer had been surgically removed. The host was finally free to thrive. Eleanor, direct to camera, radiating with empathy and hard-won wisdom. Look at me. If you have made it this far into the story, I know exactly why you are still sitting there. I know why your heart is racing, and I know why you feel that profound, cathartic release deep inside your chest. You watched them fall. You watched the arrogant bride lose her crown. You watched the golden child brother get stripped of his toys. You watched the deeply toxic parents finally face the terrifying, inescapable reality of the consequences they built with their own cruelty. But I want you to understand something absolutely critical. The destruction of that family was not the real victory of this story. Bankrupting a narcissist is easy when you have the resources. Evicting a bully is simple paperwork. The true, ultimate victory was the exact moment I turned my back, walked down those velvet stairs, and stepped out into the night air. The victory was the realization that I had the power to walk away all along. Society lies to us. Every single day, we are bombarded with toxic, manipulative platitudes designed to keep us trapped in cycles of abuse. Family is everything. You only get one mother. You have to forgive them, their blood. Listen to me, and listen to me very carefully. Blood does not equal a blank check. Sharing DNA with someone does not grant them a VIP. All access pass to disrespect your boundaries, belittle your achievements, or drain your bank account. A marriage certificate does not give an arrogant in-law the right to treat you like a peasant. For 40 years, I was the family mule. I was the sturdy, reliable workhorse who was expected to pull the heavy carriage of their debt, their fake image, and their endless dysfunction, while they sat inside drinking champagne and mocking the very hands that fed them. I allowed them to do it because, deep down, the traumatized little girl inside of me believed that if I was just useful enough, if I was just generous enough, if I just kept my head down and worked hard enough, they would finally love me. But narcissists do not love. They consume. They view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. They view your financial success not as an achievement to be celebrated, but as a communal resource they are inherently entitled to. And the moment you stop being useful, the moment you attempt to set a boundary or ask for a simple seat at the table, they will not hesitate to banish you to the shadows by the kitchen doors. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you. You cannot convince a parasite to stop feeding. You can only sever the connection. If you are watching this video right now, and you are currently funding the lifestyle of a family that treats you like a second-class citizen, if you are constantly shrinking yourself, hiding your success, or biting your tongue just to keep the peace at the holiday dinner table, I am looking directly at you. The peace you are trying to keep is fake, and it is costing you your soul. You do not need their approval. You do not need a seat at their pathetic, rented VIP table. You have the power, the intelligence, and the absolute right to stand up, walk out the heavy oak doors, and build your own empire. You have the right to be the CEO of your own life. It is time to audit your reality. It is time to identify the emotional and financial liabilities in your life, even if they are your own parents, siblings, or children, and ruthlessly liquidate them from your portfolio. Walking away from toxic people is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is the moment you stop surviving and finally start living. Right now, I want you to take a deep breath. Feel that weight sitting on your chest? The guilt they programmed into you? I want you to let it go. I want to hear from the survivors in the audience today. Have you ever had to look a toxic family member in the eye and completely cut them off to save yourself? Have you ever stopped being the family ATM and walked away to build your own peace? Scroll down to the comments section right now and share your story. Your journey, your pain, and your ultimate triumph might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to read today to finally find the courage to pack their bags and leave their own nightmare. Do not keep your survival a secret. We heal by shining a blinding light on the darkness. If this story resonated with your soul, if you felt the absolute thrill of watching a self-made woman take her power back and destroy the facade of the people who abused her, I need you to hit that like button. Obliterate it. Let the algorithm know that we are building an army of people who refuse to be victims anymore. And most importantly, if you are ready to completely rewrite the script of your life, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. By joining this channel, you are not just subscribing to stories. You are joining an elite, fiercely independent community of self-made individuals who prioritize their mental health, their financial freedom, and their absolute peace over toxic family loyalty. We do not negotiate with emotional terrorists. We do not beg for respect. We command it. Thank you for being here with me today. Remember to protect your peace, guard your portfolio, and never, ever apologize for walking away from a table where respect is no longer being served. I will see you all in the next video. Keep building your empire.